Hey everybody, Charlie Stevens here. Thanks again for joining me for another guitar lesson. Alright, so we've been learning about reading music. We've learned a few chords so far. And now I'd like to talk about how reading chords usually works for the guitar. So, when we read music, we have the lines and spaces of our staff, and each one of those represents a different note. So the real way to read chords is to write which notes those are, right? So, for instance, in the one finger C chord we learned, we had the G, which is on the second line of our treble clef. We had the C note, which is on the third space of our treble clef. And then we have the E note, which is in the top space of our treble clef. So really that's how you would know to play that C chord there. But we also have a lot of other ways to know that as well. So there's also tablature, which we've talked about on this channel. So in example 1, I've included what this chord would look like, both in standard notation where you can see actually the individual notes that we learned about, but also in tablature where you can just see where to put your fingers. Okay. Also, we'll notice that there's a chord symbol above. So a chord symbol is just basically a letter. Okay. In this case, it's the letter C, and that's the label for a C chord. And that's the most common way we'll actually read for guitar when it comes to chords, that is. When we see guitar chords indicated, most commonly it would be by use of these chord symbols, and we would have to know how to play the chord. So in classical music you see every individual note. It's great to learn it that way as well. That can be beneficial for a lot of things that the chord symbol can offer. Because if I just see a C in my music, I wouldn't know if they meant this one string version. They might mean this cowboy version of a C. They might need this C. Lots of different ways I can play C chords, and just writing the letter C wouldn't tell me which one to use necessarily. Sometimes we can add some other symbols to make it a little more clear, but typically it'd be up to the interpreter. Typically it would just be this one, to just play your regular cowboy chord C. Okay, so we don't always see them with all the notes written. It is great with all the notes written, especially if we're playing a classical piece. Again, something that's composed, and the voicing of the chord, exactly how we play that C, really matters. So it might be shown in that way. Or in tab. We can also use tab to show exactly where the chord goes. Actually, in this example I gave, the tab is more specific than even the music, because G, C, E, really know your guitar, you might know you have that here also, or even here, or even here. Those are the same exact three notes. So just looking on the page and seeing those notes, I wouldn't actually know where to do that. We do have other ways in our musical notation where I can indicate exactly what string I want things to be played on, and stuff like that. So we could use that information and make it more specific. But generally we don't see that. We see the chord symbols, okay? So we're kind of learning about that today. So there's also something called slash notation, not to be confused with Slash from Guns N' Roses, or like a slash chord, which is a type of a chord that we'll learn about at another point. But slash notations are what they use for drum notation, basically. So instead of our notations that have the rhythmic value, and they're also written on a very specific place of our staff to let you know which pitch to use, in slash notation we don't worry about which pitch to use necessarily. We'll write the chord above it, we'll say C, and then there will be slashes. Okay, if you look at the second part of the first example here, we have this C, and I've indicated some slashes that look like quarter notes, but they don't really have note heads on them, and they're not really indicating a specific note. We're just supposed to know that those all mean C. If we look in the tab, they just are regular slashes. So that one's pretty common too. Those slashes usually mean beats, quarter notes, and so you'd strum 4 times for each one you see. Sometimes those are also used to just tell you how many beats are in the measure. There might be 30 slashes, and then I might write a different chord above the 4th one, so you know that the chord changes on beat 4. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to strum 1, 2, 3, 1 and strum four quarter notes, you might be able to do different rhythms. Okay, so these slash notations really come in when we start talking about eighth notes, and we'll say, okay, the chords to a song, it's G, C, and D, for instance, and then you'll want to know what strumming pattern to use. So we can use these slash notations to kind of communicate different stuff to try that. And when we get into eighth notes, we'll have down and ups to work with, and kind of a lot more options will open up. But for right now, we're just going to focus on the same types of rhythms that we've been talking about: quarter notes, half notes, and whole notes. Okay, so in example 1, we're going to play the C chord that we learned, the easy one finger version that we learned, and then we're going to play the G7. This is called a cadence when we go from G7 to C. So don't worry about that. We'll discuss the fancy music theory terms at another point in time. But this is why I chose these two chords, because they provide us with a cadence. It's essentially the foundation of Western music, is this relationship between G7 and C, essentially. This type of cadence that is represented by G7 and C in this case. Okay, so we're going to do 4 strums on C. Measure 2 is G7, so we're going to do 4 strums there. Then we're going to go back to C for 2 beats. Okay, and then it changes to G for the other 2 beats. And then we get a whole note on beat 1 of the last measure. Okay, and we just hold C and let it ring. All right, why don't we try that together, okay? Example number 1. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, that was example number 1. Beneath example number 1, we can see the example in slash notation. So first we can see that there's tab and all the exact notes. Then we see it again, and you can notice that all the rhythms are still shown to you, and the chord symbols still appear overhead, but we don't exactly know where to play these. And the cool thing about that is now it's your choice. So when you see example number 1 the second time, you could actually play it like this, perhaps. Okay, or like this. Don't worry if you don't know those other ways to play to play C and G7 yet, okay? We'll get into those. But my point is, with the slash notation, you're in the driver's seat, okay? So there's different reasons for both of these systems, and it's important that you're familiar with both of them, okay? All right, the rest of this is very simple. In example 2, we're going to play basically the same musical example as example 1, but we're going to just use half notes, okay? So 2 half notes on C in the first measure, 2 half notes on G7 in the second measure. The third measure is going to go half note on C, change, half note on G7, and the final measure will just let a C chord ring, okay? Let's try that together, please. Example number 2. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, that's example number 2. Once again, we see example number 2 represented in the slash notation also. So the slash notation of these, you can see they kind of made it look like a half note, right? There's a stem, but there's also kind of 2 lines, so it kind of looks like a half note. And then when we get to the last measure where there's a whole note, we see the 2 lines that kind of look like a whole note now, but there is no stem. Okay, so that's how you know it's a whole note. In the tab, they never use stems, but because there's 2 of these half note looking things, we can, you know, assume that we need to strum for each of those. But like I said, that's kind of an uncommon symbol, I think. Usually when I see these, the slashes just sort of tell you how many beats are in the measure, and they're not really necessarily telling you exactly what rhythm pattern to strum, but they can be. All right, so in example number 3, we're going to do the same thing, but now with whole notes. So now this one's really simple. We just do a whole note on C, whole note on G7, whole note on C. Okay, let's give it a try together. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so that one is extremely simple for you, hopefully, if you were keeping up with the ones that we already did, but sometimes not. Sometimes those are challenging because you really have to count, right, and come in on the right time. I'm not using a metronome, so hopefully I came in the right time and you're not having trouble keeping up with whatever time I was doing here. But as we can see, there are no stems now, and there's only one symbol in each measure when we look at the slash notation for this. So that's how we know that those are meant to be whole notes in this case. All right, well, that's just a very brief introduction to slash notation and how chords look written down. And as we go forward in this course, we're going to use both ways of displaying this information at different times to help you with different things. So they're both very important, both fairly easy. Although reading the notes one is a little tough, but it's great practice, especially if you're trying to learn your fingerboard, knowing where they are on the page and seeing how they relate together in chords can be really powerful. It can help you decide how to play the guitar in different ways you might not have thought of before, because maybe you'll have a note and then another note which normally maybe you play on the same string as the first note. So maybe now you'll have to find where one of those notes exists on a different string so you can play it as a chord, right? So it really sort of opens up what we can do and gets us thinking about the guitar in a really cool way. So thank you so much for watching this video. Please subscribe to the channel, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson. Thanks a lot.